Good morning. Today is October 21st. And for today's class, I wanted to continue our conversation from last week. So this is kind of video 2 in a series of potentially 4 videos on how to handle contingent offers. So last week we talked about the 22B and everything that goes with 22B and what happens when a second offer comes in. Today, I wanted to talk about using the second offer as the second buyer's addendum. So this would be a situation where the second offer comes in that's going to be bumping the original offer, and the seller decides that they are going to accept this offer. So let's review just a couple things about contingencies in general when it comes to the 22B. With 22B, remember that you're not going to be disclosing the funds needed to close from the home sale on a 22EF if you're also using 22B. This means if you are using the proceeds from your sale to pay fully for the other purchase, then you do not need a 22EF because you're already disclosing where those funds are coming from. 22B is its own contingency, but remember it does have a consequence for not following the rules of putting your home on the market, which will waive every contingency in the entire contract. 22B, though, is its own contingency. If you're being asked to waive a different contingency while still holding on to the 22B, that is definitely possible. Just keep in mind they are separate. Consent is needed for any change in a closing date after mutual acceptance. Consent is needed for an extension or a shortening closing date that is shorter than 30 days or longer than 45 days. Consent is required for a 22B buyer to accept another contingent offer or even a pending offer. Don't put your clients in a situation where their contingencies or earnest money may be risk. So make sure you're following all of the things you need to be following when it comes to your timelines. The buyer cannot terminate before the contingency time is over on 22B. Unless that buyer has a different contingency out. So as long as that 22B is in place, that buyer has to continue to try to market their home and sell it. A seller has the complete freedom to continue marketing their property until the contingency is either waived or satisfied. The seller is able to lower the list price, hold open houses, and still allow showings. And as a seller agent, your job is to get the best offer for your seller with the best terms. So I wanted to talk about the differences between a backup buyer versus a second buyer, because when we're talking about 22B, there's a very specific way that this needs to be written up when another buyer comes in and is being used as a bumping offer. So number one, if we think about the differences between a backup offer and what that means, and a second buyer and what that means, there's a huge difference. So number one, I just pulled up the backup addendum so we could see the difference, but also discuss what they mean, right? So when you have a backup buyer, this is for a purchase and sale agreement that is already underway. It has a closing date established, and it has a timeline of which that backup offer is going to hold that backup position. This backup offer, if being used as a backup, is not going to trigger any action by that first buyer. They're just waiting for that buyer's sale to fail. When it comes to the form itself, it does have an expiration date. So that backup buyer is only in position for as long as this form is written. And that backup buyer does have the freedom to cancel this backup agreement, even if they have not yet been accepted into first position, or even if that first sale has not yet closed. When it comes to a second buyer, this is a form specifically made for contingent offers, because this is a form used to trigger the bump notice for that first buyer. This is going to create an action or a reaction with the buyer that's currently in place. Your second buyer directly affects the first buyer. So when we look at the second buyer addendum, we're going to acknowledge not only who that second buyer is on lines 1 through 4, but also acknowledge the sale that is being bumped by this. And if you notice in paragraph 1, it does refer to the bump notice. When you have a second buyer come in and fill out this second buyer addendum, your seller is free to choose whatever type of offer they would like to bump another offer. They can choose an offer that is contingent, that is pending, that is less money, more money. It does not matter. It is completely up to your seller what they want to choose as an offer that they feel is worthy of bumping the other one out of the way. It could just be the fact that your seller doesn't have as much confidence that first buyer is going to actually pull anything together, and they are still at contingent status with no potential pending date in sight. So how do we accept a second buyer and use them as a qualifying bumping offer? Well, number one, we need to reach our first line of action should be to reach for Form 39. We want to put that second buyer in second buyer position. In doing this, we are going to fill out this entire form as well as sign the purchase and sale agreement, and it's all going to be as one piece. Now, if an offer comes in, this is going to create by default a counter offer. So remember that we have timelines that we're going to be working with and going back and forth. For the form itself, we want to put the second buyer in the second buyer position, which is line 3. Referencing the first buyer in line 6 and the first buyer's property closing on or before whichever date. So once we get all of the previous sale information, we can then talk to our seller about what contingencies they may want waived before actually using this offer to bump the other one out of the way. If we remember from last week, we were talking about maybe a seller doesn't want to go in bumping an offer out of the way when the second offer has yet to waive inspection or Form 17 or whatever of the contingencies or conditions your seller feels they need to be more confident about accepting that offer through. Once you've checked these boxes and these items are done, then you can give the bump notice. Now, once those items are complete, the bump notice time to be able to serve that to your first buyer defaults to 1 day. You can then send that notice. This form thankfully helps us by directing us to the forms in the Northwest MLS on giving these notices. Now, there's a lot of forms that are involved in the communications between first buyer, second buyer, bump notice, getting permissions, and that is because if we think back to our basics in real estate, we have the statute of frauds, which means everything that we do has to be done in writing. So we give notice to every single step of the way, to every person involved in the transaction, and notice in writing. These notices are pre-written for us, thankfully by lawyers, and available for us with the Northwest MLS. So the bump notice is going to be able to be given to that first buyer default to 1 day after all of the contingencies that are checked in the above boxes are met. Now, it does explain to the second buyer kind of what happens after this. So in lines 4 and 5, we want to explain to our second buyer that the first buyer does have the option of responding to this bump notice. They have a timeline of which they are working. And in that, there's a couple things that can happen. The buyer can either satisfy or waive, or they can not satisfy or waive. So we'll be discussing the bump notice and the acceptance or waiver in an additional class. So today I just want to really focus on what happens when the second buyer is going to be put into first buyer position. Once that buyer in second position, I'm going to call them buyer number 2, is put in to first position, it is done so by sending a notice. And again, there is a form for the notice that I will talk about a little bit later on in these slides. It's Form 39N. But once that notice is given to second buyer, then all of the timelines for buyer number 2's contract begin. So none of the timelines begin before that time. You will not be able to open escrow. You will not be able to start any counting until buyer 2 has been put into buyer 1 position. And 7, in this form controls the rest of the agreement. So if this form says that inspection contingency is waived, then inspection contingency is waived, and anything else that's in the check boxes above. So here's a scenario I wanted to bring forward. So my buyer would like to accept a counteroffer that would put them in second position and create a bump for the contingent first buyer. Form 39 was sent with the counteroffer. How do I protect my buyers from being held liable to continue to wait during the bump period if they find a different house to make an offer on? They are on a short timeline and they need to keep looking for a home, even if they love this, even though they love this one. Is there language that can be included stating that my buyers have the right to terminate their agreement during the bump period or the 5 days that that buyer has to respond for that first buyer to sell their house? So no, there is not actually an out right now. There's no standardized language that that buyer broker can add to Form 39 to give that second buyer the right to withdraw their agreement. And if we think back to the difference between the second buyer's rights versus a backup buyer's rights, a backup buyer does have the right to withdraw their backup position until they are put into first position, whereas a second buyer does not while this bump period is happening. Once the bump period, of course, goes, comes and goes, if that second buyer has contingency outs, that might be a different story. So understand that upon the agreement between the second buyer, the seller and the second buyer, and the performance of any requirements made of second buyer in paragraph 2, which is the one with all the check boxes, the seller will bump this home sale contingent buyer. The seller will bump the home sale contingent buyer in the reliance that that seller has with the second buyer. So what would happen if that seller, what would happen to the seller if the home sale contingent buyer is unable to proceed in light of the bump notice and the second buyer withdraws? Well, that seller will have lost 2 buyers in that case. The seller will have 0 buyers for their house. So for no other reason than the seller agreed to just do business with the second buyer. So second buyers, keep that in mind. You cannot necessarily pull yourself out during that bump period. If you want to, it has to go in after if you have the contingent right to do so. That second buyer needs to determine whether they want to buy that seller's house in light of the requirement to deliver the bump notice to the home sale contingent buyer, or whether the second buyer wants to buy something else. It would be unreasonable for the seller and the second buyer to agree that the second buyer can somehow avoid the obligations of their PSA if the second buyer chooses another option while that bump notice is still pending. So sorry for that lengthy paragraph there, but I just wanted to bring to light the differences between backup buyer and second buyer and how important it is to kind of keep our buyers in the know when they take second buyer position. And if they have no contingent outs, then they're stuck in that spot. So how do you bump? How do you bump? Sorry, somebody was unmuted. Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to have a mutually accepted second offer. That mutual accepted offer needs to include Form 39. It probably also needs to include a counter offer form. Because by sending this is truly a counter offer. It will be mutual when both buyer and seller, and this is buyer 2 and seller, sign the Form 39, as well as any changes that may have been made throughout the rest of the purchase and sale agreement. Once that is made, that is a second buyer's fully mutual offer. But again, no timelines are going to start until the notice is given that that buyer is put into first position. Once that's done, we need to send buyer 1 the notice that that seller has now accepted an offer that is worthy of bumping buyer number 1 out of the way. We do this with a Form 44. If you have questions about which forms to use, these are listed on the 22B as well. So you are not required to attach or show the bumping offer to the first buyer. Sellers are not required. Form 44 is the bump notice. This is the notice that says a second offer has been accepted that is worthy of bumping first buyer out of the way. It is sent to the buyer number 2. And this bump notice timeline that the buyer has to respond is fully controlled by 22B. So when you're talking about 22B and you get down to the bump paragraph, this is the timeline that controls this notice right here. Once the bump notice has been served, whatever the timeline is, that is the timeline the buyer has to respond to this bump notice. The buyer can respond a couple different ways. They can either say that they've sold the house and they're willing to satisfy the contingency, they can waive the contingency, or they could choose to walk away. Now, if that buyer is given this bump notice and chooses to do nothing in that timeline,
I don't expect a big number period.
Sorry, Jason, you're unmuted. Can I mute you? If that buyer chooses to do nothing within this bump period, then by default, the sale terminates and earnest money goes back to buyer. It will benefit buyer with no action in a bump notice because the buyer will be assumed that they had not yet fulfilled the requirements to move forward. When filling out the bump notice, like I said, the no response from the buyer terminates the contract and earnest money goes back to the buyer. And the timeline is again established by the 22B paragraph where it says bump clause. And the default for this, I believe, is 5 days. 5 days is quite a long time. If your seller is in any sort of hurry, you may want to consider changing those timelines. But that essentially gives the buyer a week longer once the bump notice is received to try to get their home under contract. So here's a scenario I also wanted to bring up. Our office was sent a bump notice at 8:54 p.m. on Monday, July 10th. We have included in the contract a 5-day bump notice. What day and time would we have to release the contingency by? So Monday, July 10th, they have 5 days. Computation of time, on what day would this bump notice end? Day one of the 5-day bump period would be Tuesday. So the 5-day period includes business days only, and the bump period would end at 9 p.m. on Monday, July 17th. Okay, so now buyer one responds to the bump notice. How does buyer one respond once they get this? The response to the bump notice is Form 46. 46 is labeled bump notice response. Again, if you have questions on the form to use, this form is also listed in 22B. It is pretty specific and very helpful in letting us find the forms we need to communicate back and forth. And again, remember, based on statute of frauds, everything that we do in real estate must be done in writing, and we have forms that will do all of this for us. Now, I said before that a seller does not have to show the buyer any offer that was used to bump them out of the way. But buyers, if you are going to be accepting, if you're going to be satisfying a contingency, it is required that a full and complete copy of the purchase and sale agreement of the buyer's property be attached. This includes everything and cannot have any information redacted. You cannot redact phone numbers, emails, names, purchase price. You cannot redact anything. When the buyer receives the bump, remember what I said, they have 3 options they can do. Option number 1 is magically within this 5-day period that they had to respond, they sold their property. That would be option 1. That would mean the buyer has satisfied the contingency with 22B. They're going to attach the copy of the purchase and sale agreement that they have accepted and hopefully have it be within those 30 to 45 days and not an offer that has a 22B or 22Q because we would have needed a seller permission for either of those. Option 2 for them is maybe their property has not yet sold, but they have another way to buy this property. Maybe they have a bridge loan they can take, or they have money they're pulling out of some sort of stock account, something that's going to allow them to close this sale. They would select option 2. The buyer's property has not sold, but they are still waiving the contingency. By doing this, they do also waive all the other contingencies that are in this purchase and sale agreement, because any safety umbrella that they would have had for the purchase of their home, they're saying, hey, I didn't sell that home. So we can't go back and rely on a contingency when the buyer specifically states, I didn't get that, so I still have that protection if this is not waived. And then the third option would be the buyer saying, you know what, I did not sell the house. I can't buy this house. I tried my best. That would be the third option. Buyer's property has not sold and the agreement terminates. In this event, the earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. Okay, think about this. Our buyer has been given a Form 44 bump notice and has until 9 p.m. to satisfy or waive the home sale contingency. The buyer is expecting that multiple offers will come in on the property tomorrow morning. So it expires tomorrow night, but they're expecting all these offers that morning. If the buyer chooses to waive the contingency on Form 46, the second box, does that relieve the buyer's requirement to have the seller's written consent? Remember in 22B, we need seller consent for shorter than 30 days, longer than 90 days, longer than 45 days, or to accept another pending or contingent sale. So does that relieve that buyer's requirement to get permission to accept one of those sales from the seller? Does 22B paragraph 2 lines 22 or 23 apply if the buyer waives the contingency on a Form 46? Or said differently, can the seller find buyer in breach if the buyer waives the contingency and then accepts an offer on their contingent property that closes in less than 30 days? And or could seller terminate this unilaterally? This is kind of a loaded situation here.
I believe.
Go ahead.
I think if you're going to still do a shorter closing day, you still have to get permission because that really puts a burden on the seller of their departing rest. That's the whole reason, is to not force them to move within 30 days.
This is definitely an odd situation. I had to think about this one for a really long time. This question comes directly from the hotline, so I did not make this up, and I am not making up these answers.
I think I'm wrong.
Well, let's read through it. If the buyer waives the home sale contingency, then the buyer is no longer required to notify the seller of the sale of the buyer's property. So whether the buyer's property does or does not sell is no longer relevant to the seller because that buyer has no contingency based on the sale of the buyer's property. Instead, the buyer is simply going to be obligated to close the purchase of the seller's property 30 days after the waiver of that contingency. So consequently, the buyer who waives the home sale contingency is not required to provide notice to the seller or even let the seller know the terms of that sale. And the buyer's property, the buyer may sell their property with a closing date that is less than 30 days. So it just takes that conversation completely out of the water. Now, the risks in this specific situation are that this buyer doesn't have any of those offers in hand, and they're discussing the option of waiving the home sale contingency before they've accepted an offer, based on the fact that they are hoping to get multiple offers and hoping to get something that does close before 30 days. So this is just a risky question in general and a situation that hopefully none of us will be putting our clients in. But when you remove the contingency, you remove the rules that go along with it. Bump responses. I'm sorry, I don't know why that slide is there. Okay, letting buyer 2 know what buyer 1 selected. All right, Form 39N. We have to now let the second buyer know what the selection of first buyer was. Buyer number 2 is just sitting, waiting in the background for an answer to come through. They've been waiting for 5 days. We've had communication with buyer number 1, and buyer has selected their response. When buyer number 1 selects their response, we do need to notify immediately buyer number 2. There are going to be 2 choices that buyer number 1 makes, and we are going to notify buyer 2 with Form 39N that has either of those 2 options. Either we're going to tell buyer 2 that the first buyer has satisfied or waived their contingency and they plan on moving to close the sale, or we're going to let them know that buyer number 1 chose not to waive the contingency and had not sold their home, and they are removing themselves from buyer 1 position. Once we select notice that buyer number 1 has removed themselves, that means because buyer 2 is a second buyer under contract, they are put into first buyer position. Their timeline will start on their purchase and sale agreement when the notice is received. So once we give the notice to the second buyer of option number 2, they are now in buyer number 1 position. We must notify escrow. We have to start their purchase and sale agreement. All of their timelines will begin. I hope that this was able to provide some direction and clarity on any questions that you may have had on contingencies. Next week, we'll talk about what happens when buyer number 1 chooses to waive and move forward. But if you guys have any questions, I am going to be here and we'll be happy to answer them for you.